Welcome to the Rocky Mountain MS Center's webinar series, Maximizing Lifelong Brain Health and MS. Today's topic is Understanding Your Financial Safety Net. This presentation features Tom Stewart, a physician assistant and disability attorney. Tom Stewart leads the RMMSC Legal Clinic and directs legal services. Tom studied as an undergraduate at the University of Notre Dame and studied law at Boston College Law School. After clerking for the New Jersey Supreme Court, he attended physician assistant school at the University of Colorado, where he received a master's degree. Tom has been involved in the medical and legal care of MS patients for more than a decade. This webinar is scheduled for 1 hour. The first 45 minutes will be the presentation. If you missed something on a slide, we will be archiving this webinar on our website, www.mscenter.org, so you can replay it at any time. We'll reserve approximately 15 minutes at the end to answer questions from the audience. You can submit your questions at any time during the presentation by typing them into the chat window on your screen. We will answer as many questions as time allows. With that, we'll turn it over to Tom.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your interest and for joining us today. This program is intended for people with MS and their families who are engaged in the workforce or maybe who are in transition. That is, maybe they're in the process of applying for disability benefits. I think it's going to be less helpful for people who are already receiving disability benefits, but I think that there may be some questions at the end, time for questions at the end, and I'll try to handle that then. Before beginning, I want to be clear. I do not think that people with MS are destined to become disabled, or it's inevitable in any sense, especially with newer, highly effective therapies. However, the sobering fact is that for all 20-year-olds without a diagnosis, just the general population of 20-year-olds, more than 1 in 4 will lose the ability to work before they hit retirement age. So in other words, this is a good idea for everyone to have at least a minimal understanding about how they're protected if they lose their ability to work, and to take whatever steps they need to increase those protections if they think that their protections are insufficient. So hopefully at the end of this, you'll be able to anticipate disability in the event that it should arise and be better protected. So here's a review of the primary safety nets for most people. Note that the first one listed is family and friends. This is because in many cases it is the most certain protection. For each of the others on the list, keep in mind that if you lose your ability to work, you don't just turn on your benefits. What you have is a claim, and with each of these, something can go wrong and leave you financially unprotected. I will use a woman as an example in all of my cases, in all of my examples, because MS affects women primarily in about a ratio of 3 to 1. So imagine a woman with a working spouse in a secure relationship. If she loses the ability to work, generally there's a problem, of course, but it's not usually urgent financially. Money, of course, may be tight, but she will be protected from the worst consequences of losing an income, and possibly even protected from losing medical insurance. At the very least, there will be time for her to straighten out any denials or delays that she encounters with the other safety nets listed on this page. So just to quickly review these, the other safety nets are the most important one by far are the ones administered by Social Security, and that's SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance, which is the most important for people who have a work history. And I would say that's of the 2 programs administered by Social Security, that's the more important program by far. And then another safety net that's important for many people to know about is the Public Employee Retirement System. And this is, some people who work or public employees don't pay Social Security taxes, but they pay into an alternative system, like at least in Colorado, one that's called PARA. And then finally, there are private disability benefits for some people who generally can access them through the workplace. So these are the major disability nets, disability safety nets. And by disability, of course, I mean you lose the ability to earn a living. So I don't mean that you have weakness or gait problem. That's not what I mean by disability. What I mean is disability means the loss of ability to work. So we'll start by talking about private disability benefits. Basically, most people with MS or other chronic diseases will not be able to purchase private disability benefits on their own. However, many people have the option to get this through work. You may wonder, with good reason, whether MS-related disability would be excluded. It may be surprising, but in most cases, a pre-existing problem like MS would only prevent you from filing for disability for a year. Note that this time period may be counted very aggressively so that the time off for FMLA or otherwise may not count towards your period of work. So in other words, if you've taken a month off for FMLA and have been an employee for 12 months, you may have to work another month. So it may say 12 months, but in the policy, but you may have to work a little longer because of time off. So it will be counted aggressively against you. So I'll tell a quick anecdote about that I had a client who was trying to leave work. She had MS, and she was employed in a cognitively demanding job. And at around 11 months, she was ready to leave work because she wasn't able to do it, and it was clear to everybody. Fortunately, she was referred to me, and I was able to explain to her how close she was to being eligible, being insured through her private disability policy, and I suggested that she talk to her employer and see if the employer would keep her on for a few more weeks. I think it wound up being a month. They agreed, and then she became eligible for private disability benefits. People with a chronic disease like MS are unlikely to be able to purchase disability insurance through the marketplace unless they're able to get it through work. So if you do have an opportunity to get it through work, I think it's an easy decision that you should pay for it. And if you have an opportunity to purchase additional coverage, sometimes it'll be, for example, 50% of your income is your basic package, and that's given to all employees, and then sometimes people will be given an opportunity to buy up, that is to protect themselves to the extent of 60% of their income in the case that they become disabled. And of course, that's a good idea for someone with MS, at least in my opinion. So there are a couple other things you should know about your policy. So number one is you should look at if you have access to private disability benefits through work, you should look to find out what the contract says about pre-existing conditions. We've already talked about what is frequently described in the policy, but you would need to look. And then you should also understand the kind of policy that you have. There are generally, as I've written here, there are on the slide that there are two main kinds of policies. One's an own occupation policy, and the other is an any occupation policy. And you should know the difference between these, generally speaking, and should understand if you have private disability benefits available through work, which one of these you have. So an own occupation policy says that you are entitled to an income if you become unable to perform your own occupation. So to use an example of a neurosurgeon, it's very easy to imagine that if a neurosurgeon develops, let's say, even a mild tremor, that she's unable to continue to work with that problem. So she's unable to do her own job. If she has an own occupation policy, even if there are other things she can do, and it's easy to imagine that somebody with only with mild tremor could adapt to other jobs. It doesn't matter. The insurance company would still owe under that policy. So an any occupation policy is a policy that will entitle people to an income if they become unable to do any occupation for which they're trained. So in that example, it may be that neurosurgeon is not protected under an any occupation policy, but would be protected under an own occupation policy. The vast majority of policies that I see are actually hybrid policies. In other words, they are their own occupation policies for a period of time, say 18 months or 2 years, and then they convert to an any occupation policy after that. And the last point I want to make about private disability benefits is that there's generally a set-off for Social Security disability income. What this means is that private disability benefits, at least long-term private disability benefits, are much more valuable to people who are high earners than are low earners. And I think an example might help. So somebody who, let's take somebody who, as a first example, somebody who makes $30,000 a year, sort of on the lower end of the salary spectrum. And let's say that that person is entitled to 50% of their salary in the event they become disabled. That's $15,000 a year, and obviously is very critical for somebody who loses their job, but Social Security is likely to pay approximately as much. And so once people begin to get long-term disability benefits, and then they get Social Security, the private disability company will reduce the amount that they're paying by the amount that someone begins to receive from Social Security. So in the case of somebody who's earning $30,000, the amount from Social Security may be even in excess of $15,000, which is what they would get from their private disability company. And so the private disability company essentially won't pay anything under this kind of a policy. So the flip side of that is to consider a high earner. So let's again go back to the neurosurgeon, and let's assume it's $500,000 a year. So 50% of that is $250,000 a year. It's vastly more than that person would make through Social Security. So the disability policy is hugely valuable for that person. So long-term disability is important to think about in those terms that, I mean, you should get it if it's available, but it may not be critical if you're on the lower end of the wage spectrum, whereas if you're on the higher end of the wage spectrum, it's probably especially critical to obtain. And I said only one more point about private disability benefits, I think, but actually make another one too, which is the importance of short-term disability benefits. So for most people, well, your best case scenario from Social Security is to get, if you become disabled, is that you get an income 6 months after you stop working. And we'll talk more about that later, really much more, I think. But if you stop working, and many people, especially people with less money and less of support in terms of family, let's assume an unmarried woman, will have no income for 6 months unless she has short-term disability benefits, which is designed to protect people for that 6-month period of time, presumably until they can get to Social Security. But even so, it would be very hard for most people to live for 6 months without an income. So you should anticipate, if you don't have short-term disability benefits, and you become disabled, that you may need to live for 6 months without an income. Next, I'm going to talk about Social Security disability insurance. So what is Social Security disability insurance? So it's insurance paid for by money taken out of your paycheck every month. Most people don't even think about it while they're working. It's just lumped in with, generally speaking, taxes in most people's minds. But I like to point out, and only half kidding, while it is a tax, it's the only part of your tax that you actually get some benefit for. So it's your payroll taxes that gets you retirement benefits and, for purposes of this talk, disability insurance. So, how does one become eligible for Security disability insurance? To qualify for Social Security disability insurance, you must have received credits for working a specific amount of time and earned a specific dollar amount during the 10-year period immediately preceding your disability. So let me just break that down a little bit. So for most people, you will need to have worked 20 quarters of the last 40 quarters, and that's an awkward way to think about it. Another way to say it is you need to have worked 5 of the last 10 years. If you've been out of the workforce for more than 5 years, it will be very hard to prove that you're disabled. If your disability starts after that 5-year period, you won't be eligible for disability benefits. And so there's special rules, of course, for younger people who didn't really have an opportunity to work, say, for 10 years. So a 20-year-old would have to have earned far fewer credits, and there's a table online that someone can look up to see how many credits are needed. It's actually pretty easy to get a credit. So in 2018, a number that changes every year, $1,320 will buy 1 credit. Will get you 1 credit with Social Security, and so if you work and earn $5,280, you'll have gotten the maximum number of credits to get insured. So very part-time work will allow someone to stay eligible for Social Security disability benefits. So there's a particular pitfall that I'm always delighted to educate people about, which is I'll call it again, because really I think it comes up more with women than men, and again, MS affects women more than men. I'm going to call it the stay-at-home mom problem, but of course it can happen to fathers too. So, for example, if somebody with, let's say, MS has a baby and wants to stay out of the workforce until her children are in school, let's say 5 years, and then she plans to go back to work to help support her family. And then towards the end of that, after 5 years, she wants to go back to work, but she can't because, let's say, the MS has progressed. Well, she'll no longer be eligible to apply for Social Security. And it's a nuanced point, but I see it probably 6 or 7 times a year, and it's always very concerning when it comes up because it's preventable with education. So this is why I'm particularly happy to be able to talk about this problem to this group of people, that if the solution to that problem is to earn it would be the least amount of work that you could do during that 5-year period to stay insured would be to earn $5,280 every other year, or half that every year. That would do it too. So very minimal part-time work would prevent somebody from becoming ineligible to apply for Social Security disability. And so the next question on my slide is really how much money is at stake with Social Security disability? And these numbers are very rough estimates. I used an online calculator just to kind of get a sense for how much money somebody would get if they became disabled. And so you can see that for low earners, the amount is lower than for higher earners. But the amount that the higher earner gets kind of levels out. The difference between someone who earns $100,000 a year and $300,000 a year is not very much. So that's on the first side of the slash, is how much a single worker who became disabled might get from Social Security, again, just to give you a ballpark. And then there's also family benefits. So if you have children or other people that I've listed here on the slide, so including a spouse who is 62 years or older, for example, There are other family benefits, and what I'm showing here is sort of the maximum family benefit at each level. So again, just to kind of give people a sense, the real way you find out how much you would be getting from Social Security, of course, is to call the agency. Call Social Security. It's very easy to find their phone number online, and usually there's a pretty good delay, 20, 30 minutes on hold at least, but you wind up talking to someone very knowledgeable, and you can ask for your primary insured amount. That's the technical term for what you would get on a monthly basis. And then they can probably estimate also for you family benefits, is if you became disabled, if you described the nature of your family to them. And then actually going back to the other slide, the other way to find out if you're eligible, if you have some question, it's really the only way to do it definitively. You can do kind of a rough analysis based on the information I provided, but the best way to do it is simply to call Social Security and ask for, again, this is the technical word for it, the date of last insurance, or the DLI, and that will tell you the date through which you're insured for Social Security. So I sometimes use the example of kind of comparing it to something more familiar, like medical insurance. Again, the purpose of the program is to talk about disability benefits, but medical insurance is something that's a little, I think, more familiar to most people. So if you have, this is kind of describing more about the concept of eligibility, but if you have medical insurance, of course, you're paying monthly premiums. And while you're paying those premiums, you're insured, but if you stop paying the premium, you're uninsured. So if you go to the ER, for example, presumably while you're paying your premium, presumably they'll pay it. And then if you stop, they won't know you, and of course they won't pay it. Well, SSDI is like that. You're insured while you're working, if you've worked long enough. And then if you stop working, the clock starts ticking on when you're no longer insured. And that period, if you don't work at all, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is 5 years, after which you're no longer insured. So to find out when your date of last insurance is, according to Social Security's records, you can just call and ask for your date of last insurance too, and this, or your primary insured amount, which is how much money you would get if you became disabled. So, of course, the major two problems, there are a lot of problems with losing the ability to work, including psychological problems, loss of identity, but the concrete, obvious ones really are loss of an income. We've kind of talked about how Social Security fills that gap, but the other one for a lot of people is loss of insurance. So with Social Security disability insurance, if you were found disabled, you'll get Medicare. But it's important to know that Medicare you become eligible for Medicare 2 years after you're entitled to receive Social Security disability benefits. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, you can't receive SSDI benefits until 6 months after you stop working. Then you're entitled to your first check. That date plus 2 years, or approximately 30 months from when you stopped working, is when you'd be entitled to Medicare. And I've looked this up as to why. I mean, it seems like a pretty rough policy to hold off on giving people benefits for 2 years, or 30 months actually from the time they stop working. I looked it up to see what the rationale was for doing this and the legislative history, and I found out that it's because they're confident that people can just use their rights under COBRA to protect themselves during this period of time. So COBRA, ordinarily, you're entitled to COBRA, which is if you lose your ability to work for 18 months after you stop working. You have to pick up the tab, though, and as people learn, it can be crushing. It could be $800 a month or more, and then and it only lasts for 18 months. People might think that's the standard, but if you're found disabled by Social Security, you're entitled to an additional 11 months, and then that brings you up to the period of time when you're entitled to Medicare. At least that's the way it works theoretically. And then while I'm on this slide about insurance, I'm going to talk also about Medicaid. So Medicare is for people who are workers who become disabled, or retirees. Medicaid is welfare for people who apply for SSI. That's the other program I mentioned that's administered by the Social Security Administration. That's for people who become disabled, who don't have a work history, so aren't eligible for SSDI, and have no income and no asset. And if you get SSI, you get Medicaid, there's no waiting period for Medicaid. Some people have incidentally paid so little into Social Security that their primary insured amount, or the amount, their monthly benefit, might be low enough that they're entitled not only to SSDI benefits, but to SSI as well. But it's the minority of people that are eligible for both of these. For most people, it's one or the other. Okay, so this is a particularly discouraging slide, as you'll see as I explain it, and it relates to the Social Security disability process, and it shows the different steps in the process of applying for Social Security. This is an old slide. It's 2005, and actually the numbers are worse than indicated in this slide, but it was the best example I could find online. So what this slide shows is with an initial claim, so that is when you apply for Social Security, it's all on paper. You fill out forms and they collect your medical records, and then somebody will review this without seeing you and just looking to see whether there's enough evidence of disability in your medical record to award you benefits. And usually it takes about 4 or 5 months to get a decision, and you can see in this graph where it says initial claims, it said allowed is 36. That's 36% of people who file for disability get that with an initial application. The other approximately 2/3 are denied. So remember I said, this is the very discouraging part, that your best case scenario is that you get Social Security right away with an initial claim, and if you do, then you'll get your first check in 6 months, and you have to be able to figure out what you're going to do during that 6-month process. But if your claim is denied, and there's no average claim, so it doesn't necessarily apply to any particular person who's listening to this, but approximately 2/3 of claims are denied, and then you have to appeal. Okay, so you can see the next step is reconsideration. In some states, including Colorado, because so few people were approved at this step, you can sort of see in this graph the very small number of people who were approved at that level. Some states no longer have a reconsideration process. But anyway, it's for people who may be from out of state listening, there is a reconsideration, which is still at that same level, that's disability determination services. So the people who are evaluating initial claims, you can ask them to reconsider your claim and provide additional evidence at that level. If you've applied without a lawyer and you're denied, I think in all cases you should get a lawyer. I think especially for this reconsideration step, there's a good opportunity to turn things around. And I think it might even be helpful to have a lawyer even earlier in the process. But certainly after your claim is denied, it's a good idea. Anyway, so then if the reconsideration is denied, or in states like Colorado where there is no reconsideration, the time between an initial claim and the next step is 18 months, approximately. So imagine now, it sounded bad when I said you might have to wait 6 months for an income to start. If your claim is denied, then it could take 6 months plus 18 or so. And then, so it, you certainly, I guess the take home for this is anticipate that it might take a while. Anticipate that you're going to need some help. It seems like, it should go. There shouldn't really be any problem. I'll just apply for Social Security. Well, there certainly can be problems, and there's a lot at stake with that initial claim. So it makes sense to invest a lot of time in preparing that initial claim. Some lawyers will say, go ahead and apply, get denied, and then we'll help you with appeal. That's a terrible idea. You have 2 good claims and 2 good chances to get approved, and that's with the initial claim and with your hearing at least, if not also the reconsideration, and you should do your best at each step, including the initial claim, and hope that you can get it done, get your problem resolved then. And then there are further appeals from the hearing. It goes to an appeals council, and just 20% or so of cases there favorably decide, and then from there, if you're going to appeal, it goes to federal court, and the odds of success become vanishingly small then. So you're almost better off reapplying than taking that step, or you can actually pursue both in that case. Okay, so we talked about this. How long does it take to get benefits? At least your best case scenario is 6 months. If your claim is denied, add another 12 to 18 months of waiting for a hearing to get before an administrative law judge. And then, again, there's no guarantee there. You have probably nationally about a 40 or 50% chance of succeeding with a hearing. The judges, I think, are under enormous pressure to deny claims, political pressure. So one thing I said that it's worth it to invest in your initial claim, or to do a lot of work for your initial claim. And this is one of the things I'm talking about, is to talk with your clinicians prior to applying, find out if they'll support you, and if so, or during the application process, see if they'd be willing to write a letter to help your claim. We did a small study, and I have some of the stats here, basically just to prove my point, that if you get physician or especially neurologist support for a disability claim to explain to Social Security why you're disabled, it can help quite a bit. So what should be in that letter? I didn't really have that here, but I have it in a later slide. So your limitations. So it's not helpful. It might even be harmful to your claim to get a short letter from your doctor that says that you're disabled. Conclusion. Technically the judges will say, or Social Security will say, that that's a decision reserved to the commissioner of the Social Security Administration. So in other words, the doctors don't know if you're disabled. What physicians or other healthcare practitioners can do is say that you have limitations, so that you have limited ability to walk, or that you have weakness in your left arm, or that you have cognitive problems, and those are limitations, or that you need breaks, or that you'll have absences. And those are the kinds of limitations that would be helpful for your doctor to describe as you're going through the process. Okay, and I talked about SSI already for the most part. I'm just going to, it's the other program, so SSDI and SSI are the programs administered by the Social Security Administration for people with disabilities. SSDI was for workers. SSI, on the other hand, is for people who have no income, have no assets. The problem, it seems like, oh, good, well, that safety net should catch most people. Either most people have a work history, or they're going to have no income and no assets. Well, a lot of times this doesn't help. People have 401ks, for example, or if people are married and they have a working spouse, then most of the time they're not going to be eligible for SSI. If they have a full-time working spouse, they won't be eligible for SSI because they're considered a couple, and the financial resources of the couple are considered. So there are many people who fall in between the cracks. They're not eligible for SSDI because they don't have a sufficient recent work history, and let's say they're married or they have some assets. I think that the limit for SSI is $2,000, and if you have more than that, you're ineligible financially to apply for SSI. But the same process that I showed before for SSDI, that is going through an initial claim, reconsideration, and then hearing, et cetera, applies also for SSI. Okay, so time is passing kind of quickly here, and so I'm going to talk about a lot of material here very quickly, but this is technical stuff. You can look it up online too, and this website will be available. So the question is, well, how does Social Security decide whether somebody's disabled. Then they use what they call the 5-step sequential evaluation process. And so I copied this from one of Social Security's brochures, I think. It says, if we find that an individual is disabled at a step, well, sorry, hold on a second. Let me go on to the next one. So this is I'll go through the 5-step process in a second. The definition of disability is listed here. So you're unable to engage in substantial gainful activity. That's a number. If you're able to earn $1,180 or more before taxes because you have a medically determinable physical or mental impairment, certainly MS qualifies as that, fill in diagnosis for those words, which can be expected to result in death, which MS doesn't, or which has lasted or can be expected to last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. So certainly MS most of the time will last for 12 months. I think that, I'll mention it in a different place. So remember the 5-step sequential evaluation process, that's here. So the first question Social Security will ask is whether or not the person is working above SGA. Again, that's substantial gainful activity, and that's a number that changes every year. And as I've written here, for 2018, that number is $1,180 per month before taxes. So if somebody's working and earning more than that, they're not disabled as a matter of law because they're earning substantial gainful activity. In other words, if disability means can't work, if earning $1,180 a month means working, then somebody who earns that much is not disabled, no matter how severe someone's impairments are. So for a lot of people, this is the difficulty is that people want to know, well, I want an advisory opinion from Social Security. Will I be found disabled? If so, I'll stop working because it's becoming too much. Well, it doesn't work like that, unfortunately, I guess. You have to stop working and then sort of trust that the safety net will catch you. Because if you're, like I said, if you're still working, and anyone who's working full-time is going to be making more than that amount, you're just not disabled, and your claim will certainly be rejected. So you have to, and if you earn $1,179, I think you're still going to get denied. I don't think it's not to say it's not that unless someone who earns $1,179 is not disabled under the law, but as a practical matter, I think Social Security is still going to reject such a claim. For most people, you're going to have to work very, very part-time or stop working entirely to apply for Social Security. And yes, that's very frightening, especially if you don't have family, to sort of walk. So it's kind of like walking off of a cliff and hoping that a net that doesn't always catch people will catch you. So that's step one, is somebody working? And the next question is, is the individual's physical or mental condition severe? And this isn't usually a problem for people with MS that usually have, MS usually affects some function. The important part for this is that to be severe, it has to be expected to last for 12 months, which we sort of touched on. And if somebody has MS and it's progressive, of course, that's the case. But I think it's important to think about what happens during a relapse. If you have an MS relapse, you might be temporarily disabled, and that's not going to be meet the 12-month requirement. So if you have a disability, if you become unable to work because of a relapse, and it's unclear whether you might be getting better, I think it's reasonable to anticipate that Social Security might deny your claim on the theory that you'd had an exacerbation and you're going to recover from it. And whether or not you do, of course, it's not clear, but that's where an opinion from a physician may be helpful too. So I'm going to skip that. So step 3, so we talked about the first 2 steps. The third step Social Security will consider is whether somebody meets a listing. And so Social Security has a listing for every diagnosis, for the many diagnoses that you can think of. And then we'll say, if that person has, let's say, MS and certain symptoms or signs, then they would be found disabled without any further consideration. So let's go to the Social Security listing. here's the listing for people with MS, and this is not the only way to prove that you're disabled. But it includes somebody with, and you can read it here, disorganization of motor function in two extremities, resulting in extreme limitation in the ability to stand up from a seated position, balance while standing or walking, or to use the upper extremities. So they use the example of somebody who uses a walker. And more clear would be somebody who uses a wheelchair. So if you have a severe gait abnormality, for example, using a wheelchair or a walker, I think you'll meet a listing, and you can anticipate that your claim should go through pretty quickly, even at that initial determination stage. Even if the general statistics are stacked against you, I think if you meet a listing and have, like I said, a severe gait abnormality, I think you can anticipate that your claim will go through right away without any help, as long as it's clear in your medical record that you're using a wheelchair and need to continue that. Okay, so if you don't meet a listing, that doesn't mean, in other words, you have, let's say, as many people who become disabled do, you have invisible symptoms. In other words, your primary limitations are fatigue or cognitive problems, pain, bowel, bladder problems. You still may be found disabled, of course, but it's just going to be a little harder, especially if you're under age 50, because the rules for Social Security become more favorable as you reach as you turn 50, 55, and then 60, with each increment becoming more favorable to a decision about disability. And so to find out if you're disabled, if you don't meet a listing, Social Security will consider what it is that you can do 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And so they'll want to know, I don't know if this is something that can easily be seen on your screens, but they'll want to know how much you can sit, stand, walk, lift, carry, and what percentage of the day you can do it. It's a very unwieldy form. These are the kinds of things Social Security wants to find out what you can do, and then they're going to compare it briefly with the work you did before, the jobs you've done. They call it past relevant work, the jobs you've done in the last 15 years, and to see if the function you maintain, and this is consistent with the work you've done before. So, if you've been, just use it as sort of an extreme example, if you were a roofer and, for 15 years and now you can only lift 10 pounds, well, certainly you can't do the past work that you've done. And that's where it's important to know the age comes in, because for people under 50, then the next question is, well, okay, that's fine, you can't be a roofer, that's clear, but is there some other job that you can adjust to? Any job in the national economy, so sedentary jobs. How do you exclude those? Well, there are cognitive limitations, there are other kinds of limitations that aren't physical, but Social Security will figure out what you can do, whether you can do the past work that you've done, your past relevant work, or you can adjust to other work. And if you're over 50, then they'll kind of have a narrower definition of of adjusting to other work. And so you can sort of see more about those things there. I'm sort of speeding up a little bit here because we're going to get to some questions in a minute. So I just want to emphasize that, that I sometimes, I guess, like to joke that Social Security, in a way, doesn't care if you're disabled. What Social Security cares about is whether there's evidence of disability in your medical record. So it's critical that you have routine follow-ups and that you talk about the challenges you're facing at work, that your pace is diminished. If you're having cognitive problems especially, maybe consider getting neuropsychological testing. And then this is a list of acceptable medical sources, and this has recently changed in Social Security's rules. It's very important. What that means is that certainly physicians have always been acceptable medical sources, and psychologists and optometrists, as long as those two, everyone's talking within their domain. But what's different is that now physician assistants and nurse practitioners are also considered acceptable medical sources. So to get a statement from your PAs or nurse practitioners or your physicians about your limitations is really probably the most important thing you can do in your application to improve your odds of success. And there are others you can see, at the bottom in white. I don't know, for some reason, podiatrists talking about feet, and speech language pathologists also, but that's when they're talking about speech issues, and probably not. Although they do help people with MS with cognitive problems, my experience is that Social Security will not consider them as acceptable medical sources when talking about MS cognitive problems, for cognitive problems that really need to be demonstrated through neuropsychological testing. And then other sources of evidence that you can get in, there are no rules of evidence there. You can ask anyone really to write a letter on your behalf explaining why you're disabled. Of course, the acceptable medical sources is the most important part of it, but you can ask teachers or daycare workers, other people, family members even, to describe your disability. It may not be given much weight, but it doesn't hurt either. And this is a sample letter of what you might get a doctor to say. This is an easy case. I wrote at the bottom, due to weakness noted on examination, which is more pronounced on the right side. Obviously, I've also made it up. She has frequent falls, approximately 4 times per week. For this reason, I've asked her to use a cane to ambulate, or whatever the case may be, a wheelchair or a walker, or because of her fatigue, I've recommended that she take breaks, etc. Or during the summer she'd be absent. So these are kinds of frequently, how frequently. So kind of specific information about what limits you. I think it's useful to think about the spectrum of the definitions here, the spectrum of words that are used. So medically determinable impairments, that's a diagnosis. Right, we talked about that a little bit. And then what that causes are symptoms, and symptoms create limitations. So if you have fatigue, okay, that's important, that's in your medical record. So what? So that you need to take rest periodically or nap, or that your workplace tolerances are very diminished. So the limitation. So people with MS, should have mentioned this earlier, that MS is not a disability. Just because you have MS does not make you disabled. That's what the step 2 was in the slide that I talked about. That you have to have your medical condition has to cause significant limitations. So of course MS can be a disabling condition, and that's because of the symptoms are severe, or so severe that they cause significant limitations. Okay, so I'm going to skip this, but basically you should go and get regular follow-up from your neurologist to make sure if you're having trouble at the workplace that you alert your clinicians about that. And that's how you begin the process. You call Social Security. Okay, and then para, I'm going to just, again, briefly, just a few more slides before we take a break for questions. This is, as I mentioned, an alternative retirement system. It's got some different rules, though. I mean, similar here, you have to work for 5 years, but I think the amount that you have to earn for that period of time is much higher. You might need to, and it's going to vary by state, but you probably need to do full-time work, 5 years, to become eligible. And then, unlike Social Security, you don't have 5 years after you stop working under para, and at least in Colorado, you have 90 days to apply. So if you become disabled a year after you stop working as a teacher, that's it. You've missed your chance. And then this is a point that's often missed by people, is if you are eligible for benefits through para, and that's where you get your income, then you still have to wonder about insurance. And many people who pay into public employee retirement systems pay into Medicare. So then after applying through para, then they need to apply through the Social Security Administration to prove they're disabled, so they have access to Medicare. Okay, so the conclusions here. So, that if you have a substantial work history, you stay insured for 5 years from the time you stop working. but if you become disabled after that, you might find yourself without disability insurance. SSI is the program for people without an income, without assets. It's welfare for indigent people. For PARA, at least again in Colorado, it differs by state. You have 90 days to apply, and then that may be the end of it. And if you have private disability benefits, you should apply immediately. You have the better to apply at least for short-term disability while you're still working. And in any case, the disability has to begin prior to you stop working. And then, as I mentioned, this is the stay-at-home mom problem. If you're paying Social Security, consider staying in the workforce, at least on a part-time basis, rather than opting out, because you may find yourself without disability insurance when you are interested in returning to work, and you may not have an option at that point. So again, of course, you have to have regular follow-up, a strong medical record. Obviously there are other reasons too. The primary reason is to try to avoid disability, but if you do become disabled, you will need to have the medical record to demonstrate that. Talk to your physician or other healthcare professional about what limits you at work, and have that put into your chart if possible. Talk to your physician or other healthcare provider before you stop work. Even if you are eligible, do not assume that it will be automatically found disabled, even if you know in your heart that you can't work. I mean, it's a claim, and you have to prove it to Social Security. Claims are denied, and a lot of times things work well, and I'm not trying to frighten people, but claims can be denied, and you have to anticipate what will happen in that eventuality. And so, again, know how you're protected. Think about it in advance. Don't wait until it's here. How would you be protected if you lost the ability to work? And I think that's probably all I'm going to cover today. So we'll leave some time for some questions.
Thank you, Tom. We did have a few questions submitted ahead of time, so we're going to go ahead and start with those. You guys can continue to submit your questions through the chat screen on your window. We'll go ahead and start with, how is it that people with depression or back pain can get disability so much faster than people with MS?
Hold on, that's one question,
Okay.
if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
I don't know that to be true. I'd need to see the data. I don't think it's true. I think that when you're applying for disability, I think a lot of people have the experience that everyone else who's less disabled than you got it, why are you having trouble? And I think that's a perception more than a reality. So it's possible, I'm not excluding it, but I would need to see the data. My guess is that people with depression, my experience is that it's hard to get disability benefits based on depression alone unless it's quite severe.
So what would you suggest someone does if work is causing them to have relapses, but then they have to work to afford medical care?
Right. Well, we talked about that. I mean, if you become disabled and you're found disabled, then you would be entitled to Medicare. Of course, there's a gap in there, that 30-month gap, which is pretty big, and for people who have working spouses, that's often a way to get medical insurance. Another way is while you don't have any income, is you can apply for Medicaid in states that have had the Medicaid expansion, like in Colorado. If you don't have an income, there's no asset test. If you're waiting for a decision from Social Security, you're probably eligible for Medicaid.
You kind of covered this, but just real quickly, how much am I allowed to make for an income from work while I'm receiving SSDI benefits, and how does that impact my SSDI
Yeah,
income?
I saw that question too. Someone else was asking that. So I want to be careful. My answer to this question is approximate, and not only is my answer approximate, I don't know the exact number right off the top of my head. I think I have a good idea though. It changes every year. So there's no substitute. There's a booklet provided by Social Security that's easily accessed on the web where you can see these numbers and make sure of what they are. It's called I think it's called returning to work. Google SSA and return to work. I think that's how you'll find it. So it's a complex question because Actually, you can earn as much as you want for 9 months. And what you've done by earning money, actually, I think it's around $850. If you earn $850 or more, you burn one of your nine months that you get to do a trial return to work. And then after that, if you earn substantial gainful activity, so that's $1,180, then your income will stop for that month. And if you earn it long enough, then it will stop entirely. So you have to find that on the web and make sure those numbers are correct. But if people don't want to worry about it, they don't want to worry about triggering their trial return to work period, I think if you stay under $800 a month, that should be safe.
Can I get disability from para if I qualify medically at some point? I taught for 3 years and now I substitute teach. I think about a job that would pay into Social Security, but they all seem too tiring for me. I'm depending on my husband's career and benefits, but I'm hoping that I could get something from para.
Okay, that's a good and complicated question. So I have to kind of think about this here. So it sort of depends. I presume this person worked full time and paid into para for 3 years, and now still paying in as a substitute. I don't know the answer to how much money you need to pay into para to count towards your 5 years. My understanding is that it would have to be full-time work, but I'm not sure. So you would talk to HR and find out how much you'd have to earn, whether it would have to be full-time work to continue to become eligible under para, so to work 2 more years full-time or whatever the minimum is through para's rules is one answer to that question. And then to apply through para, and then the question is about what about Social Security? You can't do full-time work. Well, I kind of covered this. It's a great question. If you have have worked and then have recently stopped working full-time, and it's been too long, or you haven't worked 5 years in the last 10, as we discussed, to become eligible, well, and you can't work full-time, it's fine. You can earn $5,300 a year and get 4 credits. And then if you do that you have to call Social Security and find out how many more credits you need to become eligible. And you can probably get there by earning about $5,300 a year. Hopefully that's helpful.
I'm not entirely sure if do pre-existing conditions apply?
I think that question probably relates to private disability benefits, and we already talked about that a little bit. So, so you need to check the policy. My experience is most policies will say that, yes, if you have MS and then, sorry, my mouth's real dry. If you have MS and then you also have a cold, excuse me. So if you have MS and then you get a job where you're offered private disability benefits, yes, MS would most likely be a pre-existing condition, but in many cases, after a certain period of time, such as 12 months, you can apply for disability benefits due to MS-related limitations. So you need to check your policy, but the general answer is yes, it's pre-existing, but it can be handled by a duration of time on the job.
I know that I am not eligible for long-term care.
Okay.
I'm buying a long-term care policy for my husband. We are both in our mid-50s. Should I also buy another 20 to 30-year term life insurance policy on him?
Well, that's one question.
Okay.
Of course, if you can afford it, it's probably a good idea. That's a significant protection. Social Security would interestingly provide some benefits to you if your husband, let's say, it became deceased and you're over 50 you might be able to apply for disability benefits under your husband's account. But in any case, yes, I think that's a very creative strategy for protecting you.
How does this apply in Canada?
Sorry, the question is, how does it apply in Canada? And I just don't know. I'm sorry.
So turning to some of the questions we got this afternoon, we are pretty limited, but I'm going to try to squeeze a few more in. I understand that lawyers are paid up to maybe $6,000 out of a disability decision. There are many lawyers that assist the filing for this fee. Are these lawyers effective? Are there private lawyers that can be paid for by me for my benefits?
Yeah, it definitely helps to have a lawyer. I mean, of course, I'm biased. I am one, and this is what I do. But so the Social Security very carefully regulates how lawyers can charge their clients for Social Security. And there's basically one formula: 25% of retroactive benefits, if any, up to a maximum of $6,000. So many times I help people with initial claims that are awarded right away. And if they're awarded right away, that is, with their initial claim, there are no retroactive benefits. So 25% of zero is zero, which I think is why many lawyers say, go ahead and apply, get denied, and then we'll help you with your appeal. It's a shame that motivation, it's kind of built in there, is to help people when it's too late, rather than with an initial claim. But anyway, just to clarify, it's not a $6,000 fee, as you say, it's up to $6,000. But there's a lot of work taking someone to hearing, and so it can be that high if you go to a hearing with somebody. And yes, there are private lawyers. I think what you mean is for private disability benefits. And yes, it's pretty specialized. There aren't very many people who do this. So the law that applies to private disability benefits when they are obtained from your employer, that's called ERISA. So you want a lawyer who does private disability and ERISA law. And they're out there, but a little hard to find. And unfortunately, there are no rules on that. And so the ERISA lawyers tend to charge quite a lot in comparison. But they're out there. And so hopefully your claim isn't denied. But if it is, you do need help. But shop around. It will be hard to find somebody.
So we've mostly, I think, covered the question regarding how much you can make while you're on Social Security disability. But one part of the question, will my benefits change once I hit the 5-year mark of being on SSDI?
No.
Okay. And
I mean, Social Security, let me clarify a little bit. Social Security does reevaluate claims and to see if you're still disabled. And I think they're supposed to do that at least every 5 years for people. But most people with MS, it's really not a problem, unfortunately, for people with MS, because MS is progressive and there's really, usually the medical record doesn't say somebody got better. But yeah, they do reevaluate people.
I work full-time and have for 15 years. I am 64 and have short and long-term disability through my job. I am 8 months from Medicare and Social Security. Will I be able to use long-term disability at the same time as Social Security benefits?
Yes, but keep in mind that there'll be an offset for your Social Security. And usually most long-term disability policies are will only pay people until age 65. So I'm sorry about my voice, but you'll have to just look at the policy.
All right, I think that just about wraps up our time for today. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Tom, for sharing all of your expertise with us. If you do have additional questions, are interested in a consultation, the number that you can reach Tom's office is 720-367-5280. Again, this webinar will be archived.
And I just want to say that there's no charge just for a consult, too, and that's supported in part by the Rocky Mountain MS Center.
And the webinar will be archived on the Rocky Mountain MS Center website, which is www.mscenter.org, so you can replay it at any time.
And we can say, we'll say that number one more time if you don't mind.
Oh, yep. Tom's office number is 720-367-5280. All right, again, thank you all.